Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of talk about Star Wars Legion. And I did one of these videos in the past, and I'll be honest guys, I was a little bit tipsy doing it, so it might have been riddled with errors, speech impediments, and other things of the like. But it was kind of a wish list video, and I kind of put it under the guise of a predictions video, which might have been a little inappropriate, but it seemed fitting at the time. But today I'm going to go ahead and give you my personal opinion on a question I see thrown around a lot on other YouTube channels and also on the subreddit for Star Wars Legion. And that's, are we going to get the sequel factions in Star Wars Legion? Now, I know Skullforge Studios already does some First Order and Resistance models, which are third-party 3D printed. But we're talking bona fide, licensed models with rules provided by Fantasy Flight Games. And I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase on this one, and I'm going to say no. I don't think we're ever going to see the sequel factions show up for Star Wars Legion, and I think there's one main reason for that, and it's lack of content. Now, Star Wars Legion is a game based on commanding the armies on a grander battlefield-sized scale. It's quite literally in the name of the game, Legion. It is about legions battling each other. And while heroes are definitely a big part of the game, they are not the sole part of the game. You cannot make a list and run an army based on the heroes and operatives alone. And I really don't want to get too down on the sequel trilogy because there's honestly enough of that online as it is. Not saying it doesn't deserve it, it's just not what this video is about. But I think one of the biggest shortcomings of the sequel trilogy is world building beyond the heroes themselves. They seem to take a sort of Marvel superhero approach and really focus on the characters and not the conflict on a grand scale. And this is a stark contrast to the prequel trilogy, where we kind of had an inverse of this, where we had some relatively half-baked character developments, but just this very, very rich and robust world building that allowed a lot of leeway for third-party narratives and experiences to unfold. And I think this is best represented in the Execute Order 66 sequence of Episode 3, where you get flashes around the Star Wars universe and you just see so many unique items, vehicles, clone battalions, and things of the sort, all of which get to have their own story and their own place in other forms of media, video games, and eventually tabletop games like Legion. In fact, it was just the other day, 15 years after the first time I saw Episode 3, where I noticed when they're on Felucia, there's a clone trooper riding a giant caterpillar. And man, I'm really bummed I saw that after I did my unit wishlist video, because I really want a clone trooper riding a giant caterpillar in Legion. But invertebrates aside, I think this richness of world building and universe design that Lucas really focused on in the prequels, maybe more so than he should have, really did allow for a universe to unfold beyond those three films and give us a lot of great content in media that helped root an entire new generation into the Star Wars universe. So even if you didn't like the Star Wars films or never saw them in theaters, there's a good chance you went over to your friend's house and played one of the many video games that were released based around it, such as Pod Racing, The Clone Wars, and of course, Battlefront and Battlefront 2. And while I'm not the type of person to say that the prequel trilogy is better than the sequel trilogy, I do think it absolutely succeeded in building that expansive universe where the sequel trilogy really kind of failed and just kind of crutched off of the original trilogy. And really, I can't find a better example to back that point up other than looking at the units currently available and the units potentially available for Star Wars Legion. So when people ask for a new Resistance faction or a new First Order faction, I always reply with the same counter question: what would they consist of? And right off the bat, most people are going to say things like Rey, Kylo, Poe, Finn, all of which are going to be characters or operatives. There's not going to be any shortage of characters or operatives for any new faction army for the Star Wars sequels. But as I said earlier, there is so much more that a faction needs in Star Wars Legion. So disregarding heroes and operatives, let's look at the Resistance faction. What would they get for their troop option? And after doing some brainstorming, I can only think of two potential things, one of them being the Resistance troopers and the other being First Order defectors. And really, you don't get any very interesting scenes of the Resistance troopers doing anything on the battlefield. They are more or less background characters that kind of serve as a set dressing, and other than the It's Salt line from episode 8, I don't even think you see one in focus on camera. And I'm really going to kind of lay it on these guys, because quite frankly, I think they are one of the worst designs we've ever seen in the Star Wars universe. They're extremely bland, generic, and even kind of cheap looking. It just looks like somebody got some olive drab fatigues and threw a motorcycle helmet on top of them. It's something that I would expect from a kind of generic science fiction show that would show up on Netflix or cable television. One of the biggest appeals that Star Wars has always had going for it is its set and costume design, and I feel like these guys are just not representative of that in any manner. And I must not be alone on that, because I remember when the Black Series toys released, they just sat on the shelf. There was just Resistance troopers stacked up in every toy store around America. I remember going to Target and doing a stroll down the toy aisle just to get a sneak peek at what I might see in the coming movie, and all I saw were boxes and boxes of the Resistance Trooper with his lame helmet. It really feels like the costume designers in charge of this had a lot more important stuff to work on, and this was more or less thrown together as an afterthought. But as a unit in Legion, we don't really know what these guys use aside from their standard blaster rifle. They're just extremely lacking in personality, unique design, and if FFG as a business wants to look at similar sales models, they're going to look at those Black Series toys and see that these guys are incredibly unpopular, and they're probably not going to want to invest in a mold to build them. But after that, we have the First Order Defectors, and I think this could be a much more fun box set, and it's going to allow for a lot more creative liberty for FFG, which they seem to do really well with. We have the Rebel Veterans, the Rebel Pathfinders, and the Unit Upgrade Expansion Pack, where they really flex their muscles in taking a existing universe kind of aesthetic within a unit and fleshing it out to be much more flavorful. And I think it would be really cool to see a unit of ragtag renegades sporting makeshift armor, and I think hobbyists could get really creative with it in painting their armors in different ways to make fun and unique models. That being said, much like the Resistance Troopers, they don't really have much on-screen personality, and FFG is really going to have to headcanon in rules to make them a unique unit. But as far as core troop options go for the Resistance, I just don't see any other options here. And I think the Resistance overall just hits a wall very quickly in unit diversity. And after that we have Special Forces, and I really just can't think of a single unit to put in the Special Forces category. For the Resistance, I just can't think of anything. There is nothing in the films that would signify that role. And yes, the prequel movies had a lot more time to flesh out the existing lore and introduce new units like Republic Commandos and ARC Troopers that would fit in this category. But with their more stingent licensing under Disney, I don't really see that happening, and I think that ship may have already sailed. But if you guys have any recommendations for anything I might be missing in any of these categories, please feel free to leave them in a comment below. I just can't think of anything for Special Forces for the Resistance. I just can't think of a single thing. Maybe you could move the First Order Defectors over to this category, but then at the same time you have the problem of only having one troop choice. But let's not dwell on it, we're going to move along to support, and we actually do have some categories here. The first of which is going to be the Crate Speeder. Now, I actually have a lot of problems with these in the movies because they don't really do anything. They just kind of fly around and get shot at. We see that they have guns. There's a shot where it's getting melted, but they don't really use them. And the whole scenario really does feel like this bizarre kind of Helm's Deep knockoff that I'm just not a big fan of, though I do really like the design of the speeders. And I think they could fit well into the support category for Star Wars Legion. They would run on the bigger side as a model, and I think it would actually be a cool way to get a unit of more than one large model into a squad. But they would definitely be using keywords like nimble or agile, which we already see show up a lot in Star Wars Legion. I don't necessarily have a problem with them being a reskin of a different unit, but they don't have much personality beyond being zippy. We don't really see what those cannons are capable of, or more importantly, what they're not capable of. Tiny on-screen moments like that determine whether a model will have critical or impact or other rules of the sort. It's subtle, but people at FFG definitely take note on all these little details when they create their units. But after that, we have another potential support category, and that would be the cavalry mounts that we see in the climax of Episode 9. Now, I actually haven't seen Episode 9, and I'm not too interested in seeing it, to be quite honest. But you are going to see a lot of stuff show up on this list that were present in episode 9, and I think we do have to kind of give JJ credit for that, because he did seem to realize that he needed to put emphasis on building this war up as a sort of universal conflict, which the other movies might have been lacking on. Sure, it might have been too late, but hey, it gives us something to put in this video. And overall, I think this could be a fun unit, but I don't want to see another Rebel clone faction come out and also have clone Tauntaun riders. So I think they could get a little bit more creative than what the Tauntaun riders have, but oh god, it could definitely happen again. It could happen again, guys. So off the top of my head, we really only have 4 unit types we can even use for the Resistance. And I think that's just way too substandard to build a new faction and an entire new core set around. Yes, they have plenty more hero options that I haven't listed, but you can't have a core army built just out of heroes. I think that's much more befitting of games like Imperial Assault, and if Legion ever came out with a sort of kill team game type, I could definitely see a Resistance faction popping up there. But as things stand now, I honestly think I could brainstorm more Gungan units than I could for the entire Resistance faction. I mean, the Gungans wouldn't have as many heroes, but I think they would rack up more options in the other categories. And you really know you have a problem when you're being outclassed by Gungans. But let's take a look at the First Order faction. And really, I think these guys are going to have some more options for units overall. But really, when we look at it, I think it's still lacking in a lot of categories. First of all, in the core, we're going to have the First Order Stormtroopers. That's a given. They're totally going to show up. And these guys, unlike the Resistance Troopers, look fantastic. I love the look of the First Order Stormtroopers. However, I'm not sure if that look is going to translate well to a 28mm scale. They are incredibly sleek and shiny and kind of minimalist in their overall aesthetic. And I just think that lack of detail, while it looks great in actual real-life scale, isn't going to play out too well when you shrink it down to the size of a tabletop miniature. I think the sort of robustness of the original Stormtrooper helmet really helps them at that scale. And if you smooth out all those details like the First Order ones are, it's just going to kind of look amorphous from a distance. And I've seen a few third-party First Order Stormtroopers painted up in this scale, and I gotta say, I think that might actually be the case. I'm not a big fan of how they look, even with a skilled paint job. I can appreciate them, and I can appreciate the work that was put into them. Absolutely no disrespect to the artists that I've seen. But certain aesthetics just don't work out as well when they are altered in scale. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe when FFG comes out with their own hard plastic ones, they'll be heads and shoulders above the 3D printed ones I've seen up to this point, and they will look great on the tabletop. I could be wrong. But then you have the problem of a sequel trilogy, core set, box set, where everybody wants to collect the First Order Stormtroopers and nobody wants the dud-looking Resistance Troopers. But we do have 2 more potential troop options for the core for the First Order. But these are in a bit of a weird spot. We have the Riot Troopers, as seen in Episode 7 when he duels with Finn with that shock baton, and then we also have the Flame Troopers. And while you could argue that these guys could be their own sort of infantry unit, I think they would probably just be an upgrade onto the First Order Stormtroopers. So even with the First Order, you're starting to see this problem where, yes, there is some flavor here, but it's going to be stretched thin between being its own units or being an upgrade onto an existing unit. And the same thing is going to go for my next unit, which is going to be the Jump Troopers, which we see in The Rise of Skywalker. And these are basically First Order Stormtroopers with jetpacks, because they fly now. And again, is this going to be its own type of unit, or would this just simply be an equipment upgrade attached onto a regular First Order Stormtrooper squad? I'm sure you see the issue here. We have 4 potential unit types, but more realistically, they fit into just one unit, the First Order Stormtrooper, and all the variants would just be very minor tweaks in either heavy weapons specialists or gear slots. Personally, I believe it's better to have one solid unit with a lot of options to it than a bunch of units that are stretched thin and can only be taken in one way. But that's just my personal opinion. And if you really want to give it to the First Order here, you could say they have 4 options for troops. And there is another more bona fide option regardless of which way you go, and that's going to be the Sith Troopers. But I'm not exactly sure if these guys would be core or special forces. They seem like they might be pretty important, but at the same time, I don't know, are they? I don't really have any information on them. As far as I'm concerned, they're really just stormtroopers in red armor. But that does give us a solid 2 core options for the First Order. Maybe 2.5 if you're not okay with that Riot Trooper and Flame Trooper and Jump upgrade being incorporated into the regular stormtroopers. But let's move on and look at the special forces, because we do have some options here. First of all, we have Snoke's Guard, as seen in The Last Jedi. And these guys are pretty cool, and I think you could give them a lot of unique weapon upgrades and tools to make them stand out from the regular Royal Guard. I think this is a solid Special Forces unit that could be incorporated into the First Order faction. And after that, we do have the Knights of Ren, but as far as I'm concerned, the Knights of Ren are pretty much on the same boat as either Snoke's Guards or the Sith Troopers, where we don't really know much about them other than their equipment. They kind of just exist for one fight scene and then die. I'm not even really sure these guys had force powers or not. If they did, that would greatly help them stand out from the other 2 units. That being said, I think they would make for some fantastic models. They have a lot more texture to them that I think would play out in the smaller scale of tabletop a lot better than things like the First Order Stormtroopers. So there we only have 2 Special Forces options, but that's a whole lot better than the 0 Special Forces units that the Resistance has. And lastly, the First Order does have a pretty cool support option, and that is the Tread Speeder, which of course is the catapult machine that flings the Jump Troopers into the air. Because why not? Of all the ridiculous things to show up in Star Wars, this one is probably the most that is like a direct translation of an action figure. It feels like it was specifically made for them to build a spring-loaded toy out of it. That being said, it's actually kind of cool looking. I don't mind the design of it. I'm not a big fan of it shooting a rocket trooper into the air via a catapult. But hey, you know what? That at least gives it some character, something I cannot say for most of the Resistance units. At least FFG would have some rules to write around this unit and not have to headcanon everything on their own. But with 2 core trooper options, 2 special forces options, and 1 support option, that's going to be a closed book on the First Order faction, at least as far as I can tell. And honestly, I think that might be enough to warrant a sub-faction for the First Order, but introducing these 2 new factions into the game with their own core starter sets, I just don't think it's an option. There's just not the material there to work with. And I'm no psychic, I can't see into the future, but if you had to ask me to bet on it, I would put money on the fact that there never will be the material to work with. You reap what you sow, and I just don't think they sowed enough with this new franchise. Again, I didn't make this video to bash the sequel trilogies. I genuinely did make it to answer a question that I see popping up time and time again in the community forums. But I think brainstorming exercises like this do kind of show how Disney has kind of misunderstood the property that they paid so much money for. And on top of that, the team at FFG alluding to making Mandalorian models so quickly kind of highlights a lack of either interest or priority in actually making sequel faction models. And again, the most comparable thing to a miniature game is unfortunately going to be action figure sales, and the new trilogy hasn't done exactly a great job when it comes to merchandising. So overall, as an end note on this video, I think FFG venturing into sequel factions is not only going to be a kind of creatively dry endeavor, which they're going to have to make up a lot of stuff as they go, but also one based on a lackluster outlook from a business standpoint. And really, if the creatives don't want to bite at it, and if the executive moneymakers don't want to bite at it, why is anyone going to bite at it? I just really do not see it happening. It may come out one day, but I sincerely doubt that it is high on the priority list of anyone over at FFG. But I want to know what you guys think below. Honestly, I don't want to hear your stance on the new movies, be it good or bad. Keep it in relation to this video and the topic of this faction appearing in Star Wars Legion. I know there's going to be some inevitable spillover there, but that's fine. Just keep it related to the topic. Explain your reasoning behind any comments you make, and let me know if there's any units that I might have missed out on. But please don't stretch it when you're coming up with unit ideas just for the sake of having more units. I brainstormed this with a lot of other people before, and they started saying stuff, like resistance engineers and resistance pilots, and I just don't think those are things that fit in with Legion. And again, they're things that are more or less going to have to be made up from scratch for this game alone. And I just don't think that's something that FFG is ever going to waste their time investing the money, resources, creativity, and manpower into. And also, don't say things like the ATM-6, because if we're already not likely going to get an AT-AT in Star Wars Legion scale, we're definitely not going to get an ATM-6. Those things are like twice the size of AT-ATs and probably going to take up an entire playing board and more vertical space than most of us can afford. I've already done the brainstorming leg of this whole prediction kind of thing. I want to know if there's units that I missed, not just kind of random things that might happen someday with a lot of what-ifs attached to it. But as always, if you guys like this content, leave a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And until next time, take care.